right? Do the teachers have that sort of mindset of thinking in questions and thinking in ways that are curious? And I think that's a real, when they are, then the work of project-based learning really takes off.
Hi, this is Paul from Pear Tree Education. In today's video, I interviewed Drew Perkins, who is a project-based learning proponent and educator, and is the Director of Professional Development at TeachThought, a professional development organization for teachers and schools for implementing project-based learning. Drew is also the co-host of the TeachThought Podcast and has interviewed hundreds of educators, educational leaders, and thought leaders, including myself, about all kinds of views on education. As this is a long interview, I've created chapters so that you can skip to specific parts if you don't have the time to listen to the whole interview. I've also included links below for Drew's organizations, as well as some resources that he mentions in the video. I've also included the link to Drew's interview with me if you care to listen to that. Now on to the interview.
Drew, nice to speak with you.
Good to speak with you again.
Yeah.
Nice to be on the other side of the microphone, I think, at this time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I know you've had a lot of interesting interviews with other people, but I feel like it's great to speak to someone like yourself that's had that kind of wealth of knowledge and also having the organizations that you have. I'm sure you have a lot to say about things and don't often get to express those thoughts to other people. Could you just start?
I don't know if that's true.
For people that don't know who you are, could you start by kind of telling me a bit about yourself and a bit about your teaching background as well?
Right. So the story I like to tell is that I tried very hard not to become a teacher because my mom was a teacher, and actually my grandmother was a teacher. Here in my office, I have the teaching contract and certificate over here to my right as I'm looking of my grandmother from the early 30s in Erie, Pennsylvania, and she was certified to teach in just about everything. And then they added home economics, and then her yearly salary in Erie, Pennsylvania, in 1933-34. I always like to tell this story and have people guess, is $960 for the year. And of course, she could be removed or fired for change in name, which would be marriage, and change in condition, which would have been pregnancy, which was not an uncommon policy, at least here in the States back in those days. Seems like a terrible human resources policy, but besides that, right? My mother became a teacher, and as my dad was a psychologist, I thought, I want to do something different. I wanted to be a lawyer, I thought, and I went to Michigan State University, was pre-law, interned with an attorney, and thought, I don't want to do that. So now what do I do, right? So I graduated with a political science degree in 1990 and decided to move to Houston, Texas, where my older brother was living. And I was, I looked in the classified ads. There were nobody looking for political scientists. So I tried to figure out what I wanted to do. I substitute taught in an elementary school. The first classroom I stepped into, I guess, as a professional substitute, as it were, was a first grade classroom. And I was terrified, but really loved it and enjoyed it enough to continue doing that. I mean, I was doing that as I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. It's a great gig. They call you in the morning, ask if you want to come in, and you say, not today, and they'll call you in the next day, right? Where else can you get a gig like that? Yeah. But as I sort of went through some months doing that, I thought, well, I'll go back and get my teaching certificate, which I did, and completed that in the mid-90s, and was certified in secondary social studies, so middle and high school, and was really having a hard time finding a job. So I started teaching special education, and did that for a very short time in Michigan before moving to Louisville, Kentucky, where my brother was living at that point, and taught emotional behavior disorders, sort of emergency certified and that kind of thing. As again, I was trying to find a regular education social studies classroom. But taught EBD for, I think, 3 years and really learned a lot in that process. It was very stressful, very hard, and again, a huge learning curve for me. I moved to California and taught regular education, social studies at the middle school and then high school level. I was coaching basketball and then moved back to Kentucky in 2001, where I taught at the high school level. And I guess things came full circle because in addition to all of the social studies courses and being department head and some of those kinds of things, I was teaching psychology. So perfect mix of my parents, right? And did that until 2012. And right around 2010, 2011, 2012, I started doing some work with what used to be called the Buck Institute for Education. Now people would know it as PBL Works. I was a national faculty member doing PBL 101 workshops and those kinds of things. Really enjoyed that. Really enjoyed the idea of working with adults and helping them think differently about education. And sort of pursued that a little bit, and left the classroom in 2012 to work at a nonprofit here, an educational nonprofit here in Louisville called the Collaborative for Teaching and Learning, and developed a project-based learning model for them and did some other kinds of work there. It wasn't the greatest fit, so as I sort of shifted away from there, I started sort of ideating and thinking about what I might do and how I might develop my own sort of work. And in 2016, we started TeachThought Professional Development. And of course, if folks are familiar with TeachThought PD, the TeachThought is a long-running blog and content site for educators to think differently about education, sort of more progressive, humanistic, if you will. And our professional development is all through the lens of inquiry. The bulk of our work has always been project-based learning, but we do differentiated instruction, inquiry-specific, admin, leadership. We do all kinds of different work, but all of it is geared and sort of run through the lens of inquiry. So that brings me to the current day, where, of course, I host the TeachThought Podcast, of which you were a recent guest, and we had a great conversation there talking about thematic project-based learning. And I imagine that'll come up here, but I'll stop talking and see where that leads us.
Well, while you mentioned in these organizations, you also have another website called We Grow Teachers. How does that differ from TeachThought?
Right. So we have two websites. TeachThought.com is our main website, and folks will see all the blog content there. WeGrowTeachers.com is the professional development website and has lots of the content, but then also, of course, our professional development offerings, as well as the podcast. Of course, that's on Apple Podcasts and all those things, but you can find the link to, the local file there on WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as, our professional development work, workshops, and the workshop tools and resources for our PBL workshop and things like that.
Cool. And obviously you recognize that there's some kind of gap in the market in order to go about creating these enterprises. So what kind of motivated you to want to do this?
To do the professional development?
Yeah.
It's a good question. I sometimes say this with the podcast, I'm sort of selfish in that I really just enjoy the work. And I have found that there are people who are asking for it and also seem to be looking to think about school in different ways. So part of it, I guess, is that when I was doing it with what was the Buck Institute, I felt like I was making a difference and having some success and having really interesting conversations. And it was in many ways very intellectually nourishing for me. So that was a big piece of it. And, I think, as I know you do, school is something that and education just in general, is something that deserves sort of constant critique and examination in thinking about how we are doing what we're doing and why we're doing those things and how well it's getting us to those eventual targets. So I suppose the professional development piece it felt like a way to help more teachers think like that and sort of get us closer to that.
Cool. Excellent. In terms of actually implementing these ideas and these skills that you're teaching, what kind of challenges do you face?
Oh boy, many, 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 right? So every educator will know the sort of initiative fatigue, the fly-by-night, one stop or whatever, euphemism you want to say about professional development. I'm actually currently reading a book about coaching and differentiating coaching and using inquiry from Vicky Collette, and she's been somebody that we've actually had. She does some work for us in sort of lesson study. But anyways, that her book starts with a similar refrain, which we all hear, right? Is that professional development is unfortunately rarely done well and sustainable, right? People will say schools are underfunded. I don't know if that's actually true. It's obviously some prioritization. I would say most schools could use more money, but differently maybe. And that is a challenge, right? When we talk with education leaders, principals, superintendents, curriculum directors, whoever might be contacting us about our work, we always say, we advocate for sustained work, right? To think about how we don't do just a workshop, but we develop a coaching conversation relationship to develop that work sustainably. And lots of times they say, yes, that's what we're looking for. And lots of times they, for whatever reason, don't follow through, right? Maybe that's part of us, we're not meeting their needs, or we're not doing the work that they want us to do, or it seems more likely that it's just such a difficult job. There are so many things going on. Maybe some lack of clarity and sort of, this is my mission and purpose and vision, and this is, we're going to really stay the course here. Or changes in leadership, or changes in funding, or just, not particularly, effective leadership.
Okay. All right. I mean, from our previous conversations, I mentioned how I feel like there's too many people that want quick and easy solutions to everything.
Yeah.
And when it comes to project-based learning, for example, I think they just want some kind of piece of paper and say, do this, and you can say you're doing project-based learning, and they don't realize there's more to it, and they don't want to put the work in or make the changes necessary behind the scenes in order to actually do something properly, and they kind of give up as a result of that. But
yeah. Well, there's, we try to say, especially with project-based learning and sort of shifting to an inquiry mindset, just in general, is that it's generally, kind of a 3 to 5 year journey if you look at it from most perspectives, right? The first projects we want teachers to try we advocate for them being sort of small in scale, so that they can really get good at what the sort of fundamental pieces of, as we call pull teaching, right? That inquiry, and how do we pull the thinking from students and help them ideate questions that are necessary to do something, not just do something, but do it well. But the idea that they would do that sustainably makes sense, but there are things that get in the way. They think, okay, do we have the other cultural pieces in place? Do we have the logistics in place? Have we committed to this as a process? Are there other things that are in, sort of noise in the system? We advocate for leaders to think about curriculum, systems, and purpose in addition to, sort of their mission. I'm sorry, curriculum, system, and practices in addition to their mission and sort of purpose and vision. And so what are the curriculum things that get in the way or might help us do this kind of work well? What are the practices that we have in place that are doing that? And what are the systems that we have in place that are, again, causing friction or sort of greasing the wheels? And yeah, it is frustrating. It's certainly something that we don't have control over from our perspective. We can advocate for that, but obviously we can't make them continue to do work or do it in a certain way. And so, I do think that there are some structures in place in lots of schools that we see maybe are legacy things that have sort of developed over time. It reminds me a little bit of the Blackboard LMS. I don't even know if they're still around, but if anybody's familiar with that, it felt like at one point it was probably a really, really sort of innovative product, right? But it became, it seemed to me, this sort of layers of sort of things they've added on, and became this just cumbersome sort of awful experience that sort of met the needs, but didn't really do it effectively, and certainly wasn't enjoyable. I mean, who was excited about getting into Blackboard, right? And school in general kind of feels perhaps like it has some of those same dynamics, right? It's like this layers of systems and practices and curriculum, and a lack of clarity in what we're trying to do, right? Our purpose and mission and vision. So it's a challenge.
Yeah. And so I guess the opposite question would therefore be, rather than what makes it challenging, what makes it easier? Like what kind of, in terms of people's mindsets or the setup of the school, makes it easier for you to actually implement these ideas and these methods that you're teaching?
Yeah, well, it's an important question for sure. And think about, does the leadership have the pieces in place that that they will do the sustainability, that they have, first of all, clarity of mission and vision. This is what we're all trying to pull towards. Have they done some of that work with the stakeholders to sort of get that buy-in, right? Or is it, I'm the new principal and here's where we're going? That doesn't generally work. But one thing, and I've really been exploring this and thinking more about this, and I think you and I talked about this in our podcast, is the sort of mindset. And you mentioned the word mindset. How do we, I guess, are our teachers and our educators equipped with a sort of inquiry stance and inquiry mindset? Again, I'm reading this book about coaching, and it's all this wonderful language about, when to question, when to recommend, all of these kinds of things that are resonant, just massively resonant within the work that we're trying to do. And there is some language about, the audience needs to be receptive, but there is that real challenge, right? Do the teachers have that sort of mindset of thinking in questions and thinking in ways that are curious? And I think that's a real, when they are, then the work of project-based learning really takes off. And I think you and I may have talked about it, but I mean, I talk about this and wonder about this quite frequently. Project-based learning, and honestly, great teaching, is it's a big challenge, and it takes a real skill set in addition to, content knowledge. You have to have pedagogical knowledge and ability to sort of interweave those fluently. And one concern that I think is realistic to think about is, if we're going to ask teachers to do, high quality project-based learning, do they have the skill set and mindset to do that? And if not, should they be doing that? Because honestly, just like the opposite of project-based learning, or an opposite, maybe, sort of this direct instruction lecture, straw man caricature version of that, project-based learning can be done in a way that is an absolute train wreck for the teachers and the students.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not one of those kind of policy people that works at the governments and that kind of thing. So I don't think about things in quite that kind of practical, pragmatic sense of, well, you need that body of teachers to be able to work to cover all the schools that need teachers. I'm very much of the mindset of, if a teacher doesn't have the aptitude to teach in the way that I want them to teach, they shouldn't be teachers to begin with, because I feel like they either don't have the training, they don't have the education behind them, they don't have the understanding of how education should be used in the real world. And I'm thinking, well, it's kind of like the blind leading the blind. Then you're basically teaching kids to think that the way that you do, which is the complete opposite of what I want. I wouldn't want you in the classroom. I'd want to have someone better qualified, which is why countries like Finland, for example, where everyone has to have a master's degree and it's such a competitive market, brings out the very cream of the crop, and the pay obviously reflects that in countries like that, and it makes it into a true profession, and in the sense that society respects that profession, not just the pay. And as a result of that, you see the results in the classroom at the same time. I don't know if that's possible to do that within Canada and America, but that's the way I think about things, and that's the way I treat it within my own school. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, that's the old saying, those who can do, those who can't teach, right? And one thing that I think is has some truth there is that we have not sort of systemically set things up to attract and retain the kinds of people and the teachers who are really, really great. There's some sort of anecdotal and memes that go around, and there's lots of ways to think about how, I guess, quality teachers, they go to be engineers instead of becoming teachers because the pay, and certainly pay is a part of it. I don't know if I completely agree with the idea that, teaching is a calling. I think that there are some things about teaching that match up with certain personality types, no doubt. But the reality is that in many places, and at least in the States, I'm thinking of Eastern Kentucky. We're based in Louisville, Kentucky. Eastern Kentucky, for example, lots of teachers are teachers because that's the best job that there is. It's a steady job. It's benefits. It's you do have some time off, and you can be with your kids and those kinds of things. But the reality in some locations is that those are the best jobs just out there, right? There's and that's because there's not a lot of other jobs, right? So how do we develop those teachers? How do we add that to the puzzle of making teaching the best profession to attract the best personalities and thinkers to become the best teachers? It certainly seems like a sort of moral imperative in lots of ways, but boy, it's tricky.
Yeah. I mean, all too often I hear people say, oh, I became a teacher because I love working with kids. And I'm thinking, well, that's part of it, of course, but
sure, don't
you think about what education's for and what you're actually preparing these kids for? And that's kind of almost like a secondary thought. They hadn't really given it much consideration. It's like, well, that is the role of a teacher. It's not just because you like kids and you like working with them. I mean, you can be a babysitter and do that, but you have a duty to prepare these kids for their future. And if you don't even know you haven't really given that much thought, what are you doing in your classroom apart from having fun? I mean, yeah, so I always think about that in terms of what are people's motivations to become teachers. And of course that evolves. It's not one specific thing. There's something that triggers you, but you would think after a certain number of years being in the profession, something else occurs to them. And it's not often that I hear that. It's always kind of one specific thing of just like, I like working with kids.
Do you think that's different from elementary age to sort of secondary, middle, and high school teachers? Because I would imagine intuitively one might hear more of that from the younger age teachers than older, but I don't know.
Yeah, but the older ones, I think it's different. I mean, I've heard different. I don't hire a lot of high school teachers for our organization, so I don't often get to talk to them. But it definitely seems less about the kids at that point and more about, in some ways, like, I hate to say this, more about themselves. Yeah, because again, they don't know the kids well enough to think, why am I doing this? It's more kind of taking pride in their work. And again, that's a bit of a concern to me, because if you're just taking pride in your work, it's not about the kids anymore. It's more about yourself. And I feel like it's a balance. It's like, it isn't just about the kids. It's not entirely self-sacrificing, because you need to develop yourself and take care of yourself. Otherwise, you're just a hypocrite. But at the same time, it can't just be about you either, where you're just selfishly thinking these kids need to love my class. It's like, well, where's the teacher-student connection there? And I feel like there's something that's really strongly lacking in many high schools, mostly because of the setup of high schools being so big and having to work with so many different kids. It's hard to foster that relationship. But I feel like that is a key part of being a teacher, no matter what level you're at, is you need to develop that teacher-student relationship in order to be an effective educator.
Yeah, no doubt. And there's a meme that goes around sometimes that sort of gets at that, but I also think it's not quite right. It's the idea that kids don't learn from a teacher they don't like. And I think that that's sort of generally true. And I wouldn't advocate for any teacher to strive to not be liked. I mean, that doesn't seem like a good policy, right? But of course, the opposite or an opposite of that is, are they trying to be their friend? And we don't want that because there's some obvious inherent dangers in that. But I remember so my mom was a teacher, like I said, and she was actually my teacher at one point. And about 6 weeks in, she quit, not because of me, at least that's what she said, but she took another job in a gifted and talented position. And so my teacher became somebody who I just absolutely butted heads with, and we would argue, and she would take me outside in the hallway and all of those kinds of things. And especially if you'd asked me then, you say, do you like Miss Whitcomb? Oh man, I would have said, absolutely not. I hate Miss Whitcomb. I hate that class. Now, I learned a heck of a lot from Miss Whitcomb's class. And one of the things that I think is important to recognize in that sort of argument is, again, yes, we don't want our students to dislike, let's not strive to be the teacher that nobody likes, but maybe a better way to think about that is to strive to be the teacher that, 10 or 20 or 30 years from their graduation, they will look back and say, boy, I really liked or got a lot out of that experience. And Miss Whitcomb is sort of cantankerous and, I would have said mean as she was, she engaged me in ways that, while it was through conflict, and maybe there are certainly better ways to do that and help me to, think and learn, she did engage me, right? And that was important and allowed me to sort of argue with her in ways that made me think more deeply, and especially think more deeply about the content, which was at that point government. And that in the moment was not something that I liked, or at least wouldn't have said I liked, but in retrospect, it was very valuable. And I could tell you a similar, one of my favorite teachers at Michigan State University, Chuck Ostrom, was a mean, nasty man, if you look at on the face of it, and a wonderful professor. I mean, my favorite class. I was scared to death of this guy, but just an amazing experience in terms of learning. Could he been better? Maybe, if he wasn't so mean and nasty, maybe I'd have learned more, but it's not like I didn't learn anything. In fact, I learned quite a bit.
Yeah. I mean, my kind of motto is about tough love. I mean, it's not about being their friend, and it's not always saying what they want to hear either. It's about doing what you know is right for them, and for it to come from a good place. And my best experiences as an educator have always been when the kids recognized that what I'm doing is because I genuinely care about them. And although I didn't know each of them on a very, very good basis, I didn't know them well enough to say, I know that kid's name and all those kind of things. They knew that what I was doing was intended to be good for them. And the response from the class was far better than the school was getting from other teachers before them, which always led the school to ask me, what are you doing with these students that is making them react this way? Like, I had one instance where I was asking them to do a presentation, and I told them they would get bonus points if they dressed appropriately for the presentation, as if they were given like some kind of business presentation. They all came in suits and all these kind of outfits, and the school was shocked by this. Of just like, what are these kids doing? And I explained what they were doing, and they're like, wow, I've never seen these kids take so much pride in their work before. But it's, they obviously, it just gave them a sense of identity and purpose behind the learning. And I know that I made an impact on those kids, even if it was for a short period of time that I was there. So
yeah. Well, there's a similarity, an obvious similarity to parenting. And one thing that, as I've gotten older, I've thought quite a bit about this. My parents were by no means perfect, because no parents are, but I never ever thought that they were going to or would do something that would intentionally hurt me. Now, there was all kinds of times and things they did that I didn't like, and especially in the moment thought, oh, I can't believe this, right? Not letting me do this or telling me I have to do this or whatever. But I never, ever doubted that they had my best interest at heart. And I don't think we know that's not true of all kids, right? They have parents who because of emotional issues and perhaps mental issues, are not capable of doing that kind of parenting. And that's a devastating effect as for the development of a child. So if you take that to teaching, kind of what you said, right? How do we as teachers communicate? And you don't have to be, there's all kinds of ways to develop relationships with kids, and some are better than others. I recently did a podcast with a guy named CJ Reynolds, and he's got this sort of really big affect, and he's having kids read and playing sound effects and all these kinds of things. And I sort of said, well, so imagine my mom at trying to do this, right? Or somebody who's not as sort of fluent with technology or something like that. It would be silly, right, to play these sound effects and do these kinds of sort of performative things.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that as a knock necessarily, but at the very least that the teachers know, or I'm sorry, the students know that the teachers have the students' best interest at heart, even if and when they ask them to do things or not do things that they don't like. And you do that with your own kids, or at least you should. And if they know that you have their best interest at heart, it makes a big difference.
I think the example you gave, and again, I don't mean to knock it, I don't know the full context here, but when I hear things like that, I feel like it's the kind of situation where the teacher wants to be idolized in some way, and they entertain the students in a way that gets that kind of adoration from the students.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not about that. I think there's ways that you can obviously get the kids to like you, but doesn't mean to say that you have to constantly entertain them in a way and use gimmicks like, how teachers would bring the iPads out because that will make the kids like them and things like that. So that's not what you should be doing. You should be doing things because it benefits them, not because you want to get some kind of brownie points with your students and that kind of thing. Because it's just like the behavioral system. If kids constantly need rewards, then they become dependent on that. And the moment you cut that off, then they no longer like you anymore. And your relationship with them can't just be about this kind of entertainment factor.
No, there's no doubt about that. And as I have been trying to continue my journey and sort of exploring the sort of nuances and complexities of more progressive or constructivist approaches, and project-based learning certainly being part of that, and then sort of the cognitive science pieces of it, I think it's important not to caricature or straw man either version of it, right? Mm-hmm. But it does happen, right? I remember working with a teacher, I want to say it was in Maryland or somewhere on the East Coast of the United States. Anyways, we were talking about, thinking, how do we shift our teaching and do this kind of things? It was a history teacher, and he said, I can't do this kind of teaching. I'm a history teacher, and I love to tell my stories, right? Which is kind of what you're getting at. It's this sort of performative. This is about me as a teacher, and I am going to put on a show. And, I remember doing some of that, and it's not necessarily bad, right? I mean, how you engage your students and sort of engage them, use your personality. There's all kinds of different ways, and every teacher does it differently. Just because somebody is really affective and funny and engaging doesn't mean that they are necessarily the best teacher. We obviously know that, but that can work. We just can't always lean into that. That can't be the reason why you're doing this, right? And I think the same kind of thing holds true, kind of getting it into this sort of project-based learning. Back into that idea is we can't be doing project-based learning or that kind of teaching and learning solely in pursuit of behavioral engagement, and especially at the expense of cognitive engagement. And I do think that's kind of the same kind of problem that we might see in lots of classrooms. It's just not scaffolded well. There's not great teaching, but boy, it seems like they're having fun.
Cool. Yeah, you're bringing up things that I'm actually was planning to speak to you about, but I've got a question I'm desperate to ask you. and again, you've been kind of heading in that direction in terms of what you've been saying, how these other things come into your mind about like cognitive learning. How do you think that your philosophy or your perspective on education has evolved? Like, what other ideas have you kind of built up along the way that you hadn't originally considered?
Well, the one that comes to mind immediately that I think about, and it's not particularly relevant to the arguments and things that are going on right now, but is the idea of merit pay. And I used to think that I was just this really big proponent of merit pay, and I'm not against it per se. But then I sort of, as I reflected, I thought, I think I might be for merit pay because I think it'll get me more money, right? Because I thought and still think I was a pretty good teacher, right? And perhaps I'm wrong about that. And depending on what you might use as a metric to reward merit and give people more money for their teaching, maybe I would qualify, maybe I wouldn't. But I actually did get some money when I was teaching in California for test scores, which made me laugh. But what are you going to do? I don't know if I've evolved so much in terms of what I think about teaching and learning as much as I've refined it. I mean, I was never in favor of the most traditional kinds of ways. I was never a lecturer. I was never, I sort of joke or sort of giggle when people would say, "Oh, you're a social studies teacher," which they often meant, "Oh, you're a history teacher." And I did teach history, but I was a political science major, and history was part of that, but obviously not the main focus. So they would often say, or sort of make the assumption that I know all of this history. Well, I'm not ignorant about history, but I'm also not somebody who can recite a bunch of dates. So I would say that I was never in sort of a position of like, I feel like I'm the transmitter of all this knowledge, right? I am a transmitter of knowledge and expertise, and also then thinking about how do we ask questions and get people to think. So I would say that over the years, I probably have shifted in ways that are a more sophistication and more refinement of how do you do that and do it well. Now, I guess as I'm sort of talking about that, though, one thing, again, that I've been sort of exploring and thinking about is, and maybe this is something where I've sort of changed or shifted, as I've engaged with teachers around project-based learning and education, I think I probably started off in more of a macro position of this is a shift that would do education good in general, and not necessarily when I began helping teachers with it, did I maybe think as much about the scaffolding and again the sort of cognitive science. And I know I did a recent podcast with an instructional coach, Zach Rochelle, who we have sort of sparred and argued on Twitter about this. He's somebody who really believes in cognitive science and direct and explicit instruction. And what I think is that there's some real value there, some things that we really should be paying attention to, because to their point, I say they're, sort of people who are in that camp, there is often, as I mentioned earlier, sort of a lack of explicit instruction and teaching. The idea that, we can just give kids the opportunity to learn things and they'll learn them. And teacher doesn't really need to be scaffolding and doing that instruction. I have maybe shifted back towards that in some ways, at least in how I communicate with teachers, because again, project-based learning, I think, is a really great tool, but if we're going to do it, we should do it well. Just like if we're going to do direct and explicit teaching, we should do that well. And those two things aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they, I think, work really well together. And so I would say probably, the more I think about it, I probably have been more interested in making sure those pieces are in place as I help teachers than I was, 4 or 5 years ago, because it didn't strike me as something that was necessarily missing, which is part of, kind of go back to our early conversation in like the follow-up, right? So getting an opportunity to say, because when we do a workshop, we start out big picture and we ask them to do the planning, But it's not until you get further down the road that you can identify that a teacher is or isn't doing the actual teaching, and that the students are or are not actually learning, right? You say, well, how'd the project go? It was good, but you're not really getting into the weeds of how things went on a more granular level. So that's been, I think, informative as I've thought more about it.
Okay, I think I went through a similar process myself, in the sense that I looked at things on a macro level when I started making YouTube videos back in like 2010 or whenever it was. And I didn't necessarily have the opportunity at that point to actually implement the ideas and to think more deeply about them. And obviously at some point I did, but I still didn't think about it on the true micro level, in the sense that the challenges that other educators faced, I guess I just took for granted were easy to me and not necessarily easy to them. So working with other people made me think more deeply about certain practices that I had, and also my philosophy as well, and how to bridge that gap between a philosophy and an actual methodology, and how to then teach that to someone else. And that's definitely how my thinking has evolved, and also where other ideas have come up along the lines as well. So I think it's very much like yourself, that my ideas haven't really shifted dramatically at all, but I just kind of refined them as I've gone along, if only to help other educators understand how to actually implement this.
Right. Well, it's part of the process that we want teachers to engage in, that reflectiveness, right? That critical thinking and asking questions and saying, all right, what am I trying to accomplish here? And how do I best do that? And then in reflection, how do I know if I've done that? And if not, then what do I need to do differently? And I mean, I wrote a blog piece. I think it's like 3 questions to make deeper learning work. And, the 3 questions, it's sort of like, this is groundbreaking, right? Let's clarify what cognitive path we want them to go on. What do we want them to think about and learn? How do we teach it and help them learn it? And then third, how do we assess it and know if they've learned it, right? Which, it's almost, when I say it out loud, it's sort of like, it makes me giggle. So it's like, well, no, right? Like, of course, but unfortunately, that is, those things need to be reminded, right? That we, again, can get into sort of bells and whistles and flashy things and, all the things that make it, Pinterest worthy, as we sort of joke about. But are the kids learning the things that we want them to learn? Are they thinking about the things we want them to think about?
Cool. Excellent. And so now that you bring up the blog post that you did, that's one of the questions I wanted to ask you, is that for me, I feel like some of my most popular videos are, for me, some of the least important ones. And the ones that I feel like are my best ones are so, in some ways, so niche that no one really cares about those, but I feel like they should. What do you feel like are some of your standout blog posts that you're most proud of, or even videos or interviews that you've given?
Well, that's an eternal battle. So Terry Hike, who started TeachThought, and he's written a lot of the blog content and sort of makes the publishing, editing decisions. I would say joke. It's not really a joke, though. It's a frustration in similar ways. It's right. The pieces that he, and I would say somewhat similarly, have found to be just, I really thought they were valuable. I thought they were interesting conversations, or something that I think teachers really need to hear, are often not all that well trafficked, right? And the ones that are the most trafficked are, 6 tips to manage your class in 6 minutes, or something like that, right? Which is, it's the sort of Pinterest worthy. Is it something that you can, my podcast, as you well know, is generally conversations of about an hour. And I do that because I think that's about the time it takes to have a really thoughtful, nuanced conversation. But there are podcasts that are much more popular that are, 8 minutes long, because it's 8 minutes to, their chunks, and people are busy. I get that. I was talking with Paul Kirshner, who is, of course, one of the cognitive science sort of gurus. And it was so funny, before we started to talk, I said, these usually go about an hour, sometimes a little shorter, sometimes a little longer. And he said, which I thought was really interesting because he's much more sort of a traditionalist. He said, I would think that a half hour would be a max. And he said, even half hour podcasts I listened to on double speed. And I thought that was funny. But, I think that's true. People are generally looking for small bits and easy ways. And the reality is it's not easy. There is no easy way. There are no magic bullets. And one of the things that is, I think, a truism of education, and it's an unfortunate truism, is that one of the reasons we aren't as effective as we should be is because we don't take the time, don't have the time, don't want to take the time to really dive into the hard conversations and to have those conversations among colleagues and look at the work that we're doing, look at the work that our colleagues are doing. And it's messy, it really does take some time. So to answer your question, I mean, the ones that I've found to be most useful and interesting, I think are ones that address some of the complexities, but those aren't necessarily the ones that are most popular.
Okay, excellent. Well, at the end of this, you can share those with me and I'll pop them as links underneath so that people can check them out. And maybe you'll get some more traffic directed at those. So in terms of one of the things that caught my eye about your organization was a quote from Terry on one of his blog posts. And he said, a good school doesn't make empty promises, create misleading mission statements, or mislead parents and community members with edu-jargon. It's authentic and transparent. And that's something that really stood out to me as a frustration within Vancouver, is that there's a lot of schools that piggyback off not necessarily our ideas, but definitely the approaches that we use, and use these terms like progressive or project-based learning. And I feel like they do so in ways that just are not justifiable. Like, they're not progressive in any shape or form. They don't really do project-based learning in the way that I define it.
Sure.
In what ways have you seen that schools are using such terms and you think that that's not that?
Well, yeah. In what ways have I not seen it? I mean, it's more typical than it is. And I suppose, you're maybe to extend, some grace is we want to extend our mission as an ideal, like this is what we're after, but maybe we're not doing it as well as we want. I at the teacher level, I often say, if when we do a project-based learning workshop, if I had a nickel for every time some teacher said, I've been doing project-based learning for years, and what they've been doing is something that's more like doing a project, sort of front loading the teaching and not particularly rigorous or deep thinking, then I would have a private island, but I don't. And the numbers are, again, kind of getting back to the sustainability piece, that the educators or leaders that say, we really want this to be sustainable, but then they don't. It's sort of the new thing that comes along, and every teacher in the world knows the story of this is the next new thing, right? Like, and there are schools that are better about it, no doubt. There are schools that have that clarity and do continue on that path and don't get distracted by the new shiny thing. But schools have, again, it's more common, I think, than it's not, that schools are saying they're trying to do this or going to do this, but not really. I mean, mission statements are littered with all kinds of vague terms that never really get into practice, right? It's like 21st century learners and prepare them for the future. And, I think that's a real valid criticism of the sort of maybe cognitive science group of like all this edu-jargon, right? On the other side of that, if you are only looking at, this is one of the things that I have I guess, pushed back on, or maybe explored and pushed back on. I do think there's real value, and again, sort of using cognitive science as a sort of umbrella term, is like really making sure that we're doing good explicit instruction and those kinds of things, and not getting caught up in this sort of edu-jargon of whatever the buzzword du jour is.
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean that you're serving the kids in ways that are sort of the full picture, right? I mean, it strikes me that cognitive science educators tend to be a lot about efficiency, which reminds me of how economists think of the world, right? And so economists are a very valuable sort of line of academic thought, right? I wouldn't disagree in any way, but an economist, if you look at the sort of marginal utility of having children, would say in no way, shape, or form should we have children. It's a total loss. You'll lose money, you'll lose sleep, you'll lose time, you'll be frustrated, and you might have your heart broken, you might lose a child. I mean, all of those things. And so they wouldn't advocate for actually having children. And of course, there's much more to having children than the money, the sleep, all of those things, right? So there's an opportunity cost of dismissing and not looking at some of those bigger picture, sort of idealistic, utopian 21st century skills kinds of things that can happen as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of my professors when I was doing my master's was very gung-ho about the whole cognitive approach.
Mm-hmm.
And he was getting us to read multiple journal articles about using computer tutoring systems that would essentially look at a child's response to a question and would then give them an optimal question to follow on from that, and thought that this was the future of education, is that kids would just learn from computers. And I was just horrified by this. I just thought, where's the human element here? Like, the teacher just walks around the classroom. I mean, I've seen this with language learning, where students are learning from computers, and if they have a problem, the language teacher would step in and help. But I mean, I don't believe that works for a start. I don't believe that you can just learn a language just from technology. I feel like you need that naturalistic, like genuine, authentic kind of cultural response with the body, the mannerisms, the body language, all those kind of, things that you can't get from a piece of text or hearing an audio on a computer. But likewise with teaching in general, I don't feel like students, especially children, can learn from a computer and not from a teacher. I feel like if you take that element away, I mean, learning is a social process. And if you replace that with technology, there is no social process. In which case, I mean, they did the same thing with television. They said that television was the future of education, that kids would just learn from TV. Mm-hmm. And that didn't turn out to be the case. And I think a computer tutor to replace the teacher as being a better way of learning, it just horrifies me. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, there's a book, and I did a podcast with the author Audrey Waters, and it's called Teaching Machines, I think. And it wasn't, when I got the book, I thought, this is not going to be very interesting. And it was fascinating, because it was really the idea over years and years ago. I think it was Bandura, and the sort of machines would just be able to teach kids. I mean, it was really kind of what you're talking about, and it was fascinating. And obviously, kids can learn from computers and technology, right? You said they can't, but I think what you're meaning, there's a limited scope of what they can learn, right? We can learn from sort of an asynchronous, course that's giving us question after question. And there are things that can be learned there, just like there are important things that can be learned with sort of the cognitive science and direct explicit instruction. But what's missing and nearly impossible to recreate from a computer is that interaction and that sort of art of teaching that one might say, all right, I know that I get a sense that they might understand this. And this is something that I did in my classroom and talk with teachers. It's called a confidence meter. I would ask, instead of giving them points for homework or, for answering questions, because I found they were just sort of gaming the system for points, I would say, I want you to answer the question, sort of short answer, but also there was a sort of 3 circles, almost like three circle Venn diagram is what it would look like visually, with a line through the middle. But the answer, they would answer the question, and then also on the top half of that line, the top half of that circle, mark on the, put a check mark or X of I think I got this, or maybe I got it, or I'm really confused. And then my feedback to them was, but you got it, or maybe, or you're confused. And a computer can't really quite discern that, right? In a technology solution, you're either right or you're wrong. It doesn't have that maybe. And so a maybe means, I think you might have it, but you're not really explaining it well. Can you explain it differently? Can you explain it better? And that is an obvious example, or a way in which an actual human being can and should be a part of that process. But that begs the question, are our teachers, how well are they equipped to do that? And how do we equip them better to do that, right? That sort of gray messiness of, and this is part of the cognitive science versus sort of, more progressive teaching, I think, is big abstract questions and big abstract concepts. Direct and explicit instruction can help you know something, but can it help you understand it? Certainly it can, and they would argue that there's inquiry in that, but it is important to distinguish between knowing something, right? Someone can know a lot about COVID-19, but not understand it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a pretty stark example, right? We know a lot more now than we ever have, and we still don't seem to understand quite a bit about it, right? I mean, I've never, to my knowledge, had COVID, and nobody really knows why. It's really something that we've got to keep our eye. We have to keep our eye on the bits of knowledge that are important. How do we build that and use that? But then also use the inquiry process and sometimes technology can help us, but that sort of craft of developing and playing with the ideas in ways that help us come to bigger understandings.
Yeah, I mean, you are right that I do believe that young people can learn from computers. You're mm-hmm. quite right about that.
Sure.
Yeah, I guess my point was that there's that human side of things where, for example, as irrational beings, what logically you think is going to be the outcome isn't necessarily going to be the outcome. And it's not necessarily because the student doesn't understand, but right. their mind might not be in the right place at that time. There's things going outside of the school or between their peers, which a computer doesn't recognize. And if a kid is suffering from frustration, the computer's mm-hmm. not going to know that. It's just going to keep pushing these questions, thinking that this is going to solve the problem. And obviously a teacher can see in a student's eyes when they're just not in the zone for learning at that point, but a computer doesn't recognize that. So
let's hope so.
Yeah. But I do feel like there is a role for technology. And if anything, I think it's something that can be a teacher aid in terms of like when we're trying to implement certain skills within our themes, it takes a lot of research from us to figure out like something like calculus, for example. Mm-hmm. I've seen like schools like High Tech Hyde try to implement calculus, and I don't think they've done a bad job of doing that, but it's something that's occurred to me as we progress up to the high school level of, at some point, we need to address how these skills are going to be used in context. And in the real world, skills like calculus are used for very high level things to do with like medicine or engineering, things that are beyond what we could probably do at our high school levels. How can we do this at the high school level in a meaningful way without it being just beyond everyone's ability? And I feel like technology could play a role in helping us bridge that gap to make things meaningful. But I wouldn't necessarily want my students to be exclusively learning from technology instead of from myself or from an educator. So I feel like there is a role for technology, but I don't think it's a replacement for teachers. So yeah.
No. Well, the building of critical thinking takes practice, and there are people who say, "Well, we can't teach critical thinking," and it just seems like such a nonsensical assertion. But like the other day, somebody on Twitter, sort of made some comment that I think they were at the doctor's office, and they were, maybe it was not doctor, but it was some sort of profession like that, highly degreed and that kind of thing. They were getting information from this professional and essentially saying, well, this is why I don't know anything about this. So directed and explicit instruction, of which is an example, this is why this is important, and of course they're sort of straw manning or caricaturing, saying, if I was discovery learning, I would just have to figure it out on my own, which, again, there are some reasons to think about that. But my response was, and they didn't respond to me, but it was, that's certainly a role that, just as a teacher, we want the teacher to have extensive knowledge about whatever content they're teaching, right? That is an important piece. And we want doctors to know what they're talking about so that they are a source of information. But we also know that we need them to be thinking critically. But, even at the more sort of basic level, as a consumer, whether it's consumer in the classroom or consumer in a doctor's office or a lawyer's office or whatever, that you might think before you go into the doctor's office, what do I need to know? What are the questions that I should be thinking about, right? And while you might not identify all of the questions that are actually really, really important, to be able to think about that in advance and in the moment and afterwards, to say, okay, now that I know this, now I need to know this, right? So now you've told me this, so that makes me think about this. And are we teaching our students to do that? Or are we teaching our students to say, well, the doctor said do this, and unquestionable, just go ahead and do it, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't want to give doctors a bad name, but just like every profession, there are some that aren't particularly good, right? I mean, COVID was a great example. There are some that say do this and this and this, and the evidence doesn't really support it. And, it's something we've got to, again, keep our eye on both of those balls, not just one.
Okay. And now, I want to talk more about your podcast interviews. So I know that you've done so many. What ones kind of stood out to you as, I guess, ones that, you talked about this kind of binary mentality that people often have, and therefore the straw man, and that therefore occurs as a result of that. What things have stood out to you as a way to bridge the gap between the two sides, or have shown that this side has a point, but this side does as well? Like, what kind of interviews? You've done so many. So are there any specific highlights for you that have really stood out from both sides of the so-called spectrum?
Yeah, it's, some of the episodes and people that I've talked to have stood out. Richard DeFore was one of the early interviews or conversations. I don't call them interviews, but conversations that I've had that I thought was really, really interesting and useful. Not in terms of what you're saying, sort of this either or, this sort of binary stuff, but just a really thoughtful. And if folks aren't familiar with Richard DeFore, he was sort of one of the sort of, I guess, godfathers of PLCs and Solution Tree, which is a big professional development company. And he was actually he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, had written this book that is really amazing called In Praise of American Educators. And we actually talked long enough that I split it into 2 episodes, and he has since passed. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting is maybe he had a little bit more freedom, or maybe more of an imperative to be more forthright, because he knew he was passing. And so he may have said some things that somebody who's, trying to preserve their position or not rile any feathers, to keep working, right? Because that is a danger, is you say the wrong thing, and increasingly you say the wrong thing and you could be sort of, I guess, canceled, or, people will not hire you, whatever. He didn't seem to have any of those kinds of things. And again, he wasn't talking about controversial things in terms of, culture war stuff, but to say, some things that need to be said. That, like, one of the things he said that I thought was really, and I share it with educators sometimes, is he uses this term, this viable curriculum, or something like that, minimum viable curriculum. Anyways, something like that. But he said, if we're going to deliver this effectively deliver this kind of curriculum, we're going to have to choose what we want to teach and prioritize to teach, and perhaps not teach some other things, which of course is sort of heretical. And being able to share that and talk about the ways in which PLCs, but we actually use his sort of list of 7 questions that one should ask and consider when doing any sort of major initiative. It's like what questions, why questions, how questions, because teachers are going to and should say, why are we doing this? How is it going to be done? What happens if it doesn't go well? I mean, sort of thinking through those as an educational leader before and while you're doing professional development, so that the stakeholders have some voice in it and they know that you've thought about it and that kind of thing. So we actually sort of co-opted and modified his sort of 7 questions. So that was one, I guess, 2 podcasts, because it was 2 parts that I really, really enjoyed. As far as, sort of exploring the nuances and some complexities, again, inquiry and curiosity, and trying to use language that sometimes might be, like, let me think out loud here, or recognizing that, okay, so that might be one point, but is there a tension here, and how do we sort of navigate that tension? One of my more recent podcasts that I've recorded, and probably be out maybe December or something like that, was about culturally responsive teaching. And I find there's a real tension between sort of a real focus on identity at perhaps the expense of our shared and common humanity. So trying to say, so how do we balance that? How do we think about that? How do you think about that? And, I might disagree with you on that, but where's the tension? And do you recognize the tension? Part of that, and generally the guests come on, I think they either know or are aware that I might ask sort of devil's advocate questions, whether or not I agree with them, just because that's how you unpack the complexity. Occasionally, there are people who will opt to not engage in that conversation. And sometimes I tell them up front, say, look, you've made some very bold claims here in your work. I think it's interesting, but just know that I'm going to ask you some questions that may not be complimentary. It may push back, again, either out of genuine disagreement or at least as playing devil's advocate, because there might be people who disagree with such a bold claim. And that's how we sort of figure out where we land and how we think about those things. And, I don't know, I try to model those conversations as best I can, and hopefully people find them to be useful. Again, I'm sort of selfish. I just really enjoy the conversation. So when people say, well, what if you did this and this, you'd have more listeners, you'd be like, I don't really care, right? So, and maybe that's part of the secret, right? It's not that I don't want more people to listen. I certainly do, but I'm not willing to sacrifice and do all of the things that seem to be getting the most attention, be outrageous, be provocative in a way that's non-productive, arguing. I sort of go by the mantra, or try to go by the mantra of, seek to understand and be understood. And it's okay if you disagree. As long as you understand what I'm trying to say, I won't be bothered that you disagree. And I want you to understand. And I also want to understand what you're thinking, so that I can either change my mind as quickly as possible. And that's what one should seek to do, right? Say, what is it that I think and believe? And then how, as I continually test that and try to disconfirm what I think is true. And if I find I'm wrong, I want to be wrong for a short amount of time as possible. So can I change my mind as quickly as possible?
Yeah.
And I don't change my mind a whole lot, because on some of these things, because I've thought through them a lot, but boy, I really want to. And, sort of the cognitive science is a piece that is an example, right? Like I hadn't really thought as much about that as I probably should have, and trying to really get that into, and we'll probably in try to include that more explicitly in our work in project-based learning.
I mean, I think you and I come from very kind of different cultural backgrounds, but I think there's so much we have in alignment in terms of our our views on things, but also our values as well. I mean, one of the things that stood out to me about what you just said was the sense that you're not going to compromise what you do for the sake of getting more listeners, which to me just speaks of integrity. And the same thing's true for our school as well. There's certain things that other schools do that I'm just not willing to do because I don't believe they're ethical things. I'm not going to name what they are here, but I've talked about them a lot on my blog posts. And it does get me some flack from people saying that I'm basically putting other people down. But I feel like it's something that needs to be said, that I'm not willing to compromise our values. And that's the reason why growth can be slower. It's because you're not willing to do those things that creates that rapid growth, because you know that you're compromising your morals and values, and you just become a hypocrite in terms of what you say that you're doing and teaching the kids, but you're doing something that espouses the complete opposite of that. So I'm just not willing to do those things. But yeah, a thing that you mentioned as well in terms of the interview that you had about the cultural values. Again, this is something that kind of in many ways could make me a controversial figure here in Vancouver, is that the BC curriculum has been changed in a way that very much puts the First Nations culture within the curriculum in a way that we become more aware of it, we become more respectful of it, and it becomes more part of, I guess, Canadian culture as a whole. But I feel like it's done in a way that perhaps creates too much reverence and no kind of normal critique of a culture. And that's where I kind of take my issues with this, is that I don't think that value in a culture means that it's absent from any form of analysis or criticism, just like we're not either. And likewise, as a multicultural society, I feel like other cultures within the city deserve the same kind of analysis, not necessarily on the same level, but at least some recognition that they're part of the curriculum as well. And largely they're absent from the BC curriculum, and it just kind of puzzles me. I'm just like, you're holding one up as it's something we need to not just acknowledge is there, but also revere with no reflection on the reality of their life. And you take that human component away from them. You're othering them in the sense that you don't want them to be part of your culture because you treat them in a way that makes them seem so, perfect, and therefore can't be part of our imperfect culture. Right. And for me, I take great issue with that, because I feel like when you're talking about things like reconciliation, you want to bring cultures together. And when you other people, it makes it very hard to connect with them then, I feel. So I don't know if that was something that came up in your podcast with that.
Well, yeah, I mean, generally, yes. And one of the things that I have sort of been harping on is, here in the States and maybe there in Canada, the sort of critical race theory debate being, sort of prevalent, right? And I push back on the idea that critical race theories, infected all of our schools and all this stuff, right? I think there's some evidence of sort of critical thought and that kind of thing. And the thing that I try to push back, because I see versions of sort of critical race theory and kind of what you're talking about, this idea that there are sort of one group of people that are better than others and are more virtuous or whatever. And I see it on the left, I see it on the right, and I see it as a liberalism. And two books that I think all educators could really, really benefit from reading, both by Jonathan Rauch, who wrote in 1993 Kindly Inquisitors, and then I think in 2020 followed that up with a book called The Constitution of Knowledge. And both of those books are just outstanding. They work, the second one is in many ways sort of a sequel to the first. But what he's really getting at is the idea of liberal science. And this it really goes with our inquiry process and inquiry stance as teachers, right? That all ideas are subject to criticism. There is no group of people or one person who has the truth or is more virtuous than anybody else. And we have to continue to sort of work through these processes of finding what we would say, and I'm putting in quotes, truth, because it is what we have a consensus to believe is true, right? And again, all of those sort of truths are subject to constant criticism and examination, and we would change our thinking. The earth used to be flat, now it's round, right? And that happened because people continue to sort of pursue and examine that truth, and evidence then showed. And now most people at least agree that that it is true that the earth is not flat, right? Not everybody believes that, but certainly most people. And I think we can categorize that as a sort of truth, right?
Yeah.
And the idea as teachers that we lose our sense of liberal science, that we're constantly engendering and sort of advocating for and growing this mindset where we want questions to be how we process information and think about how we make sense of the world and make meaning of the world, as opposed to the opposite, which is that shuts that down, right? That says anybody who questions this is a bad person, and that we know what's true. And 2 + 2 is 4, right? And actually there was a big debate about whether 2 + 2 actually equals 4, largely semantic, but that's what the culture war does. And again, we have to have our teachers, at least in my opinion, have our teachers sort of supportive and foundationally continuing to grow a sense of inquiry that supports what Jonathan Rauch would say liberal science is sort of constitution of knowledge, the process that we should continue to go through. And that some ways people on the left and people on the right are shutting down. And sort of, I'm actually wearing under my sweater a shirt today. It's election day here. And I thought it was somewhat apropos that FIRE, which is a Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, used to be education, of which I'm a supporter of. The shirt says, free speech makes free people. And, that free speech is the opposite of illiberalism, or an opposite of illiberalism, shutting down the speech, saying you're not supposed to say that, that's bad. And again, we see it on both the left and right. We have to continue to be inquisitive and curious about the ideas, which is different from, teaching our times tables and what words, actually mean and things like that. Well, maybe not so much the latter, but, there are some foundational facts and things that we don't need to continue to ask, well, does 2 + 2 actually equal 4, right? That I think is a little different, but, here in the States, 1619 Project says, we should look at the founding not in 1776, but 1619, because Nicole Hannah-Jones and the 1619 Project say that that's what we should do. I think it's a heck of a question. I don't agree with it, but it's a heck of a question. Let's use it and examine it, right? And those things, if you say, well, I think the 1619 Project is wrong, you run the risk of some people saying, well, you're a bad person. And that's not how we continue to make progress.
Yeah. No, ultimately, I think what we're trying to get at here is that what you and I do and what other people do along the lines of what we're preaching is essential, especially right now, where you see that kind of free speech about things that seem so obvious, but you can't verbalize that for fear of being cancelled or being censored online. I think it matters more than ever in the sense that we have to continue promoting critical thinking and the idea of getting kids to connect what they're learning to the real world. Because I feel like we're in somewhat kind of dangerous times at the moment where, if you can't speak, then you have this majority voice, even though they're not necessarily the majority, but they're the mainstream voice at the moment. And it's in some cases, what they're saying seems kind of insane, but you can't say anything about it because of the vitriol you get in response to that. So I agree with you about the, promoting the free speech and how important that is. So to wrap up, this generally is going to be heard mostly by an international audience. In what way do you feel like they can connect with you best? Do you do anything virtually, or do you feel like there's certain resources you have that would appeal more to an international audience? And in terms of people who are listening within North America, how much outreach do you have in terms of what you do in terms of professional development?
Yeah, we do international work and have always done international work. We do more online work now than we ever have because of COVID, and certainly that changed the infrastructure and people's, willingness to engage with it. But we do, and have been. I was in Germany working with a school in August. I've been, again, very fortunate to have worked with a school in Rio. I've been in Ecuador. We have worked virtually with a school in Pakistan, many other places. So we do most of our work in the States for sure, but we do a fair amount internationally, Mexico. And actually, I'm having a conversation with somebody, I think, in Quebec right now. So yeah, I'm always happy to talk with people. They can engage online. They can, if they want to have us come and work with them in person, which certainly has lots of advantages. And the main disadvantage, of course, is the cost. But our one of the things that I think is a feature of how we do work is that we have a very low overhead. So while I think sometimes I say, well, it'll be this much, it seems expensive to me in relative to, somebody who, like, for example, in the project-based learning work, we are much more, quote unquote, affordable than, PBL works or somebody like that because of overhead. And so it definitely, can be more expensive. It's more expensive for us to come to Germany than it is to, go to Tennessee, for example. But it doesn't. It's not typically as much as other organizations. So, but then again, like I said, we can do work online, and that is certainly something we've done a fair amount of.
Awesome. So I will obviously share your links with this video to people, and I'd love to get from you some of those blog posts and also some of your resources that you'd love to share as well as your connections, and somewhere or another people can reach out to you in whichever way they feel like is best.
Yeah, the website, of course, is wegrowteachers.com, and the blog posts there, I don't know that I would share one or two or three that I would say, boy, really find this. There's categories, go along the top menu and you can pick categories of blogs that are PBL specific, for example, or inquiry specific, or some of the other things that we touch on. And some of them are just more general, so they're sort of under the teaching banner, as it were. I'm actually looking in our podcast in ways to sort of make playlists and say, here's a bunch of PBL specific podcasts, because now we're up over 300, and I can imagine it'd be a little overwhelming to just go through all of them and try to figure out, what the titles mean and that kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know, again, that I would say go to this. If you're interested in PBL and want to learn more about that, go to wegrowteachers.com and click on blog, and PBL is a category, and there's a ton there, and inquiry and differentiated instruction. And if you want to reach out to me, you can always email me. My email is Drew, DREW, at teachthought.com. And I'm on Twitter until Elon Musk shuts us down, the evil Elon Musk. At D Perkins Ed is my handle there. I don't really do a whole lot of other. I don't quite think TikTok is something I want to engage in. And Instagram, and TeachThought is on. TeachThought and TeachThought PD are on all the social things. We don't have TikTok yet, and probably won't. But you can search for TeachThought. It's at TeachThought, or at TeachThought PD on Twitter, or Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn and all those kinds of places.
Thanks so much, Drew. Thanks for speaking with me.
All right, thank you.
Cheers.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Drew. Please check out his channels below. I may interview more people like Drew in the near future. And if you enjoyed this video, please click the like button below. And if you'd like to see more upcoming videos about 21st century education, please click the subscribe button. Thanks again, and see you soon.